We are right in the middle here in February in Black History Month. Well, I guess we're 2/3 of the way through Black History Month. And it might be interesting to think about why we have Black History Month at all. Now, I'm not saying that it's a bad idea per se, but what I'm saying is that it makes sense at a time when the issue of what blacks did in history was somehow being systematically excluded from the history profession. If all they were teaching you about was history minus blacks, then you'd argue, wait a minute, if we can't reform the history department and have a more full or inclusive or balanced picture of history, we need to have a separate program called Black History Month. Or even in the university, the analog for this would be Black Studies departments or Black Studies programs. But we all know that today the truth is sort of, well, almost the opposite. You've got so much focus on Black history that very often not just whites, but other immigrant groups, other types of ethnic groups are downplayed or ignored. People learn hardly anything about Hispanics. They learn hardly anything about Asian Americans. They learn hardly anything about American Indians. So if you ask people, what do you know about American history? Pretty much all they know is the Civil War, Civil Rights Movement, and a few signposts along that way. But they don't know anything else. If you were to ask them things like, can you tell us who the key figures were of the modern industrial revolution in America? They'd be like, vacant look. A few years ago, Morgan Freeman, the actor, was being interviewed by Mike Wallace. And Mike Wallace said, I understand you're not too happy with Black History Month. And Morgan Freeman answered it beautifully. And the clip is, by the way, on social media. You can look it up. Morgan Freeman says to Mike Wallace, hey, Mike, you know, you're Jewish. What do you think of the idea of a Jewish History Month? Do you like the idea? And Mike Wallace goes, oh, no. And then Morgan Freeman goes, well, why not? What's wrong with having Jewish History Month? And of course, Mike Wallace, you could tell, kind of belatedly gets the point. He realizes, wait a minute, I want Jewish history to be part of history. The Holocaust is not like a Jewish event. It's an event in the history of the 20th century and a very important one. So I want it to be taught in the mainstream history class that way. But the moment that Mike Wallace admits that, he has to admit that there's something inherently problematic with the idea of giving Black history a month. And so that's... So I think Morgan Freeman gets very much the better of that exchange. But look, we have Black History Month, so it is. I want to talk about a lesson that it will probably never be taught in Black History Month, or never be taught the way I'm going to deliver it. And that is, I want to revisit the famous debate between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois in the early part of the 20th century. So this is a debate that occurred basically 100 years ago between what were then the two greatest black men living. Not the two greatest black men of all time, but the two greatest living black men at that time. A scholar named W.E.B. Du Bois, who was a northerner. In fact, he was the first black to get his PhD at Harvard University. He became a prominent professor, and he wrote important books, including The Souls of Black Folk. At the other end was a southerner, a southern black guy, born a slave. Booker T. Washington grew up to become the head of the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, and became in his own way an extremely prominent figure. In fact, got an honorary degree at Harvard, set up all kinds of philanthropic programs, very often with white philanthropic support in the South. A major figure who wrote a classic work that I highly recommend to you. In fact, I think it's probably the single most important single work by a Black American. It's called Up From Slavery. Even Frederick Douglass's great works, his 3 autobiographies, don't compare, in my view, in terms of force and relevance to Booker T. Washington's Up From Slavery. I read that book, by the way, when I was in India. And it's interesting. I'd never met, obviously, an African American. I knew very little about American history. And yet I found that book deeply interesting and very moving. And Booker T. Washington became one of my heroes before I knew very much about the history of blacks in America. Now, turns out that there was a debate, and sometimes a little acrimonious, more acrimonious from Du Bois's side. He was the guy who opened up this attack on Booker T. Washington. Now, Booker T. Washington, who was very influential at the time, did retaliate by blocking W.E.B. Du Bois from getting certain access to speaking engagements and being invited to certain conferences. So it ended up being a two-way fight between these two prominent black men. But when we come back in the next segment, I'll tell you what the fight is about, because I think it has a pressing significance even now in the 21st century.